Hello, my little Luxxes. I'm your host, Charsie Luxxx, and this is another episode of Luxxy Charms, and it's also another episode of Ghost Stories My Father Used to Tell Me. Well, actually, I should kind of give this one a little bit of a different title this time. This one I might have to dub as Ghost Stories My Parents Used to Tell Me, because this was one that both my father and my mother used to talk about and tell me. And this one is actually a paranormal true story. So this is one that actually is a ghost story that happened to both of my parents. Or I should say, instances of where something shocking happened to them in an old home that they used to live in. They used to tell me and my brother as we were growing up, and of course it turned into one of the many different ghost stories that my dad would tell us when we were out either camping or, at the bonfire. Because if you lived out in the country, you would understand that we would have something that was called a bonfire pit, where you just, on a whim, out in the middle of the country, you will just make a huge bonfire and make like s'mores and cook hot dogs and that kind of silly stuff. But of course the number one thing we would always do is tell the ghost stories at the campfire. This one happened years ago to my parents when, I want to say shortly after they first got married. They had lived in an apartment. Well, they went from the tiny apartment they were in because they couldn't stand it, because it was one of those duplex houses where they were on the upper floor, couldn't stand their neighbors underneath, couldn't stand their landlord type of deal. So they found a tiny house in the city that they were living in that was a decent amount, but one of those situations where they're uncomfortable where they're living, so they really just want to get out, and wanted a different landlord and everything like that. So they found this tiny house that they could rent out. Really wasn't in like the best side of town to be living at. What I mean, this house was tiny. I mean, it was itty bitty. It had one bedroom, and it had the space of the kitchen, a little dining room area, and a tiny little space for like the living room area. No upstairs. And it did have a basement where my mom and dad used to talk about the fact that you had the furnace, the water heater, and all that down there, but they also had the washer and dryer down in the basement. But it was separate from the house, so you didn't have a staircase that you could go through from up in the house to go down into the basement. You actually had to travel outside, and you had to go through a storm cellar to get down to the basement of this little cute little tiny house. I was trying to think of a title to give this story, and this would have been in the mid 1980s, and because my brother wasn't born yet, he was born in 85, so maybe even almost like the early 80s. I should just call this one The House. Yeah, we'll call it The House. And so my parents' first paranormal experience at this house was that one night when my parents were sleeping, my mom woke up. She could hear like a strange rattling noise happening out in the kitchen. And, at first she's just kind of like sleepy, thinking maybe I'm just hearing things. Well, she thought she could hear the rattling noise again. And then she could have swore she could have heard like cabinets opening. So she wakes up my dad, and by the time she wakes him up, he's just kind of like, what's going on? And she starts explaining to him. She was, well, of course, trying to whisper. She's like, I think someone's in the house with us, because she's like, I swear I can hear someone out in the kitchen. Gets up, my mom gets up with him, and I think at this time that they kept a bat in the bedroom, kind of as a weapon, because like I said, they weren't living on a good side of town in this city that they were living in before, and so they had a bat that they kept in the room, kind of for protection in case somebody did break into the house. And went out into the kitchen. Well, didn't see anyone, but they did see that several of the cabinets were sitting open. And so my dad's like, okay, you obviously did hear something. So of course they're freaked out, thinking, okay, somebody had to have been in the house. They turned on all the lights, they started investigating and checked everywhere that there could have been a hiding spot in this tiny little house. Couldn't find anybody. And I should say, the one door to the house was still locked. All the windows were shut and were bolted. So, thinking it was odd, and they're like, okay, can't really do too much about it, and so they went back to bed. Well, the next time that there was an instance of something happened to my father. He had gotten home from work, and generally he'd get home from work around like 3:30 in the afternoon. Well, he would generally beat my mom home from work by at least, I want to say, by at least an hour to 2 hours, and she also got off of work later than him, so he would beat her home every single time. Well, when he had gotten home, he decided, I'm going to start doing some laundry and that. Of course, since the basement was detached from the house, it's underneath everything, but you have to go outside and you have to go through the cellar door to go down into the basement. My dad had taken a hamper full of clothes, and he had went out and went down into the storm cellar, and of course they had to keep the storm cellar locked and everything for obvious reasons. And so he went down into the basement and he started loading up the washing machine, and all of a sudden he started realizing that he heard the front door to the house open up, and he could hear footsteps stepping into the house. And he said it was clear as day. Somebody opened the door, somebody walked in. Of course, my dad's thinking, oh, well, my wife's home early, and that's kind of weird, so something must have happened. So he calls up to her. I don't want to give away my parents' names, just for the fact of privacy reasons, so I will dub my mom K, and my dad I will dub E for now. So my dad calls up and says, hey, K, what are you doing home early? All of a sudden he says he realizes the footsteps stop, and they're not making noise anymore. But nobody says anything. So once more he's like, Kay, can you hear me? How come you're home so early? Did something happen at the plant? But nobody responds or anything like that. So he's like, okay, maybe if I call a little louder. So he calls a little bit louder, and he's like, Kay, can you hear me? I'm down in the basement. All of a sudden he starts hearing the footsteps start moving again. And he's like, Kay? And he's like, well, maybe she's about to head out of the house and she's going to come around. And so all of a sudden he's like, he stopped hearing the footsteps again. And he's just kind of listening. And he's like, why is she not responding? So finally my dad just stops what he's doing. He goes up the stairs to head out the cellar door. And he comes back to the front door. Well, where he sees that the front door is shut, which he had never heard the front door shut. He heard the door open, and so he opened the door and he went back in and kept looking around, and he's like, hey Kay, where are you at? No response, nothing, didn't hear anyone, didn't see anyone. Kay, are you here? And then it dawns on him and he looks outside and he's like, well, I don't even see her car. Because with this tiny house, unfortunately, they didn't have a garage or anything, so he saw his truck out front, but he didn't see my mom's car anywhere. So he's just kind of thinking about it, and he starts wandering around the entire house, but nobody was in the house. So, of course, this freaks out my dad, and he's like, okay, that was weird. And then he's like, well, maybe she got home, grabbed something real quick and left. And he's like, well, no. He's like, she would have heard me in the basement and she would have responded. She would have seen the truck and she would have talked to me. So he's like, that's just weird. So here's my dad, kind of freaked out. Somebody was in the house, and then he's thinking, he goes, was the landlord here? So dawns on him, he's like, well, I don't really like if the landlord's going to come over and start poking around the house and come in without permission or anything like that. So my dad actually calls the landlord, and the landlord had no idea what he was talking about. Hello, editing me here. I just wanted to make a quick correction here. While I was telling my story and just kind of on the vibe of going with the flow, I forgot to note that when my father had originally called his landlord, that he didn't reach him, that he had gotten a voicemail, and that the landlord had called him back later on. And this was the conversation after the landlord had called him. So sorry for any confusion, because this was a time before cell phones, so not everybody was able to just pick up the phone and have a connection with someone. So sorry for the interruption, but I wanted to have this correction. He goes, I'm actually out of town right now. I'm visiting family. And he's like, I have not been over at your place since you guys moved in. He's like, I haven't been over there. And my dad's like, okay, I just wanted to make sure. He's like, and he told the guy what had happened. And the guy's like, yeah. He's like, that is strange, but he's like, make sure you keep the doors locked and everything. He goes, unfortunately, in that neighborhood, people could be wandering around, and if they see that the door's unlocked, of course, in my dad's head, he's like, yeah, I went out to do laundry and that, and I just left the door open. So then my dad's kind of freaking out, like, well, maybe someone did come into the house, and because they heard him in the basement, maybe they just left. So he checked the house to make sure nobody had stolen anything, but from what he could tell, nobody had taken anything, which gave him a little more relief, but still freaked him out that somebody had gone into the house. When my mom got home, he had even asked her. He's like, hey, Kay, did you happen to come home for anything and then you had to leave? And she's like, well, no. And of course, he had noted that when she did get home, that this was her usual time she'd get home after she'd get off of work. My dad proceeds to tell my mom the story about what had happened. And of course, this freaks her out, and she's thinking, oh God, somebody came into our house. And so in their heads, they're just thinking that a regular person had come into the house. Well, several nights later, my parents wake up to a weird crash happening in the kitchen. And of course, this freaks out my parents, and they're thinking, oh my God, somebody's broken into the house again. And so parents try to be calm, and they hear crashing in the kitchen again, and they can hear rattling of the dishes, and they can hear the cabinets rattling and opening. And so my parents try to get up, and of course, this was back before cell phones. So, well, I mean, there were cell phones, but only, like, the rich of the rich had cell phones, and they were those monster giant cell phones. So my parents didn't have that. The only phone was out front that they had to get from a landline. And so my dad grabbed the bat that was in the bedroom with them. And of course, I can just picture my dad going like this with the bat, going out, and going, who's out here? Because he's trying to be intimidating, and of course yelling like, I have a weapon and I will use it, like, who's in this house right now? And you have my mom like kind of hovering behind him like, oh my God, what's going on? And they get out to the kitchen, and nobody's out there. They didn't hear anybody leave, didn't find anybody in the house again. There was several broken dishes out in the kitchen area. Several of the cabinets were open again. The front door was locked, completely shut and locked. All the windows were bolted. But from what they could tell, nobody was in the house. Nobody had been in the house except for what they could tell had happened with the dishes. This is freaking my mom out. She's not happy in that situation whatsoever. So the more and more it looks like it, to them, it's not someone breaking into the house. It's something ghostly, something paranormal that is doing this, because obviously they can't find any trace of somebody breaking into the house from what you hear from paranormal movies. I think even with like poltergeists and things like that, that you hear about them enjoying to break things, especially dishes and things like that, to freak people out. As time goes on, weird things keep happening at this house, like very strange things, and there were several other instances where my mom would wake up in the middle of the night where she'd want to go to the bathroom, and she could swear while she was going to the bathroom she could hear somebody walking out in the like living room, dining room area. Well, she'd find my dad asleep. And this is, mind you, this is within seconds, of only seconds of her going to the bathroom, hearing the footsteps moving around, and then her going back to the bedroom, and he is just zonked out. So, of course, she would even wake him and ask him, like, hey, were you just up a second ago walking around? And, of course, here'd be my poor groggy dad, like, yeah, what are you talking about? And, of course, then it would dawn on him, and he's like, oh, you were hearing someone walking around again. My parents obviously had the situation to where it just was commonplace that weird shit was happening at this house, and it always sounded like somebody was walking around in the house or opening doors. And so my mom finally had it. Obviously, after some time, my parents found a way to break their contract of living at that house because my mom was not comfortable living there. My parents like to talk about the story of the haunted little house they used to live in, and my dad would even like to drive us out to the area just so he could show us this house. And it was a tiny, tiny little house. I shouldn't say was, because it's still there. And it's just one of those interesting things where you go by it and you would have the weirdest feeling when you go by this house. I don't know if it was that feeling because I knew the stories that my parents told about it, but it was this creepy little gray house. And like my parents talked about it being a cute house, but when we went by it, it's like, that's really not a cute house. Like there's something weird about that place. And like I said, that could be an undertone to the fact that all the years of hearing my parents talk about the haunted little house that they lived in and rented, I got the idea to want to talk about this one because of Freddie. So shout out to my friend Freddie, and was talking about just different stories and ideas and things like that, and kind of got on the subject of talking about the true stories. And my dad always had obviously the ghost stories that he loved to tell, but he also had a lot of like true stories, which is probably why I grew up always believing in ghosts and the paranormal and the supernatural. It was just because, especially for my dad, he just always had something really weird and strange happening to him as he was growing up. So for all I know, it was something that was always following him around. I don't know, but I know my mom wasn't thrilled about it because she did not want to stay living in that tiny little house that had an unwanted roommate. Or I guess for the poor ghosts, that my parents were the unwanted roommate in their domain. Thank you for joining me for a different version of ghost stories my father used to tell me. That this one was ghost stories my parents used to tell me, and that this one was based on true events that happened to them in the past. The more I think about it over time, I think I would rather it be a ghost than to know that somebody was breaking into their house and doing weird, creepy things in there, or somebody that would have a key and just willy-nilly going in there and helping themselves. I mean, who knows what could have possibly been with this landlord. I mean, I guess he could have lied to my dad and told him that, no, I wasn't visiting your house, I was visiting family, I didn't go into your place. But thank you for joining me on another Luxxy Charms, and I hope you enjoyed this ghost story with me, and just kind of wanted to change it up and tell you one of the true stories that he used to tell me all the time. And you can find me, Charsie Luxxx, on my Twitter for Charsie Luxxx with Luxxx, or on my Instagram for Charsie87. And you can also find me on my other YouTube channel with my friend DC for Little Channel of Horrors. And once again, thank you so much for joining me on here. And don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you enjoy the content that you have here, I'm hopefully going to just keep popping out more different ghost stories as we go along over time, and try and advance it, and maybe even start putting in some of my short stories that I have written over the years that I have never put out there into the universe. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Until next time, my little Luxxes, we shall see you. Bye. Do 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 do. Keep trying to think we should have some kind of a theme song for these ghost stories, but I don't know. Need some ideas.